having to like directly fight these people. You can have political opposition that's not necessarily just complete non-cooperation. And then I think lastly, OG haven't really shown why leverage to extract concessions exists on their side literally at all, which we've provided the analysis on and which I'm going to expand upon with a couple extra mechanisms. Okay, Jason has already told you why material conditions are literally the thing that is the precursor to the existence of a state or the existence of any local authority. So there's three mechanisms by which our case accomplishes this like key priority. I think firstly on the continuation of state institutions that like courts, police, like schools, at the point at which these state institutions are actively hostile to the occupying authority and at the point at which these institutions cannot exist without the consent of the occupying actor who has the ultimate leverage here, the counterfactual is just the disintegration of these state institutions and their replacement by more hostile actors. This looks like replacing the police force by like foreign soldiers. This looks like replacing the court system with foreign actors. Why is this so bad? I think this is likely to result in a large amount of low-level conflict between citizens as these new figures of authority are so despised. I think this is exacerbated by the hostility that occupants are likely to have to the population at the point at which they literally just fought them in a war. I think the result is reckless endangerment of citizens to low-level conflict. I think optically this is a huge symbolic display of oppression that further agitates powerless populations to ignite tension and engage in more of this low-level shit stirring that is so harmful. I think this irreversibly damages the ability of these citizens to buy into any state authority at all. I think then secondly, on asserting a counter voice, I think occupants want to reduce military costs to them. I think this is their priority because they've already won the war. I think hence they have a huge benefit to relieving their partial security responsibilities to existing government institutions that are already in the state. They have a huge incentive to do this because it costs a lot of money to constantly arm and place military installments in another country. I think because of this huge incentive to want this, we have a huge amount of leverage on our side to extract concessions from them to be able to offload these responsibilities. This looks like concessions like getting some amount of devolved power straight away. This looks like getting some degree of benefit from the resource extraction they might be engaging in. And this looks like some optically beneficial displays of sovereignty to your citizens and the ability of them to feel some sense of hope that things might get better in the future. I think our last mechanism here is stability of supply lines. This is probably the most important thing in this whole debate. I think this looks like active low-level continuous conflict, regularly shutting down the movement of people and resources. I think this looks like low-level conflict, making operation of industry impossible, i.e. it's hard to have an operational factory or farm when my workers are all actively at threat of engaging in conflict against the occupants themselves or could become collateral victims of such conflicts. I think this looks like the shutdown of supply lines, making this kind of production completely unreliable. This is unacceptable for a few reasons. I think you're putting the ability of citizens to access necessary resources in danger. You put the ability to make a living in jeopardy. And I think you incur massive amounts of food insecurity. I think this is logically prior to every other argument in this debate because of Jason's analysis about the existence of the state hinging on the material well-being of their own citizens. I think this is also the point at which you decrease the ability of citizens to have any kind of buy-in in state authority whatsoever. I think what OG majorly lacks is a path to freedom. I think they've displayed like, oh, we can resist, we can have all these token low-level resistance, we can constantly resist them, and this will somehow like encourage a state that has literally won a war against us to like give us concessions or give us freedom somehow. I think at the point at which you've already won the war, this is just not going to happen. I think our path to freedom is such that continuous negotiation and formalized unified political resistance to occupants avoids the fractional low-level conflicts that are likely to endanger the material well-being of citizens, but also result in a splintered regional low-level resistance groups popping up that preclude a unified political force with unified incentives in regard to concessions that they're seeking and trying to extract. I think what this looks like is that your seat at the negotiations table doesn't exist, but even if it did exist, because none of you like even agree on what concessions you're willing to make, because nobody agrees on who the authority and who the leader of your movement is, you're unable to ever extract concessions ever. It's like the yellow vest protests in France. I know this is an occupied state. When nobody knows what agrees on what concessions they're actually looking for, you can't get any concessions at all. I think the reason why freedom is likely on our side is that if the purpose of invasion was resource extraction, the goal is probably to do this at the lowest material cost. And I think allowing regions to govern themselves and operate their own institutions is the least costly option for occupiers. I think also if the purpose was resource extraction, once supply lines are already established and stable, there is literally no need for the occupant to remain militarily active in the country. I think also if the purpose was security, I think international optics probably play a role here because they act as a mechanism to avoid prolonged and unnecessary occupation, i.e. if no threat exists in the state anymore to your security, no interference is really necessary anymore. Okay, I'll take a POI from closing now.
There will always be some resistance, like terrorist groups, etc. So they will still send in their secret police, right?
Okay, I think at the point at which resistance is most likely to occur is the point at which supply lines are shut down, people have no way of making a living, and government institutions that they rely on for their livelihoods are no longer operational. I think we can probably fiat that maybe there will be some low-level conflict, but I think the scale of magnitude of the conflict is entirely different on our side when the response to the occupation is complete rejection and complete opposition. I think there's just a huge degree of magnitude here. I think as well, the resource analysis probably also stands for this thing about security. I think at the point at which you've already deposed the threat that you've perceived, there's literally no reason to waste a bunch of money on soldiers occupying a country that like you no longer need to go to. I think also this tackles a bit of the stuff about mobilization. I think a lot of this is predicated from on the resistance actually being good. I think we can claim this like some capital to mobilize through legitimate institutions and not have a huge power vacuum after, because we have a bunch of factional splinter groups forming that don't actually agree on any of their ideals or how they want to govern anyone. I think this is also likely because no one buys into state institutions anymore to result in no buy-in to like this new state that you've formed, even though you haven't proven a path to freedom anyway. For all of these reasons, so proud to oppose.